Representative Ilhan Omar had just labeled the U.S. president a six-time financial failure whom the country ought to deport, doing so with a smirk before an audience of 10 million viewers. The room erupted, generating 70,000 social media shares within 3 minutes, as she believed this evening belonged entirely to her. However, she offended the absolute worst individual because Donald Trump simply chuckled, a genuine, authentic chuckle. He then delivered a single phrase, and from that exact moment, the entire political foundation Omar had constructed over the past 7 years started disintegrating. This occurred not due to his anger, but rather his amusement. And an amused Trump represents the absolute most perilous force on broadcast television. The committee chamber carried the scent of brewed coffee mixed with floor polish, along with the distinct electrical tang produced by excessive broadcasting equipment radiating intense heat in a space intended for a much smaller capacity. The media section was crowded 3 rows thick. This wasn't the standard minimal C-SPAN coverage team, but rather a maximum mobilization featuring all major networks and news wires. A pair of courtroom illustrators sat in the rear, as certain publications maintained the belief that hand-drawn portraits captured truths better than photographs. Omar occupied her seat at the testimony desk, wearing a rich crimson headscarf paired with a dark blue jacket. She maintained a rigid posture that resembled standing from the torso upward rather than merely sitting. It was the physical stance of a female politician who had spent 7 years in the legislature and her entire prior life learning to command presence in environments that would rather she remain invisible. Her hands rested together atop the desk before her, documents neatly arranged, her drinking glass brimming. Every single item was perfectly positioned. Trump made his entrance through a lateral doorway rather than the primary threshold, as the main path would necessitate navigating through the assembled journalists. He favored arriving from a vantage point, allowing him to observe the environment before the environment could properly prepare for his arrival. He took his position at the panel desk, tweaked his audio equipment a single time, and evaluated the chamber much like a gambler scanning a betting floor, fully aware of the probabilities and highly satisfied with them. The Congresswoman's introductory remarks were robust, spanning 4 minutes. She recounted her asylum seeker background, skipping the shortened narrative usually provided to them. She detailed the Kenyan displacement settlement, the agonizing 4-year delay, and the 12-year-old child who reached the United States without knowing the language, only to be informed by authoritative males in chambers identical to this that she was an outsider. Her vocal tone remained completely steady, and her gaze stayed locked directly onto the broadcasting lenses. She referenced the political gathering from 2019, specifically highlighting the 13-second vocal chorus of supporters shouting for her deportation while the commander-in-chief remained at the lectern, allowing the spectacle to unfold. She then addressed Trump directly, stating he had encouraged the nation to deport her. She contrasted her arrival from a displacement facility possessing absolutely nothing with his privileged upbringing, where he inherited vast wealth only to face insolvency on 6 separate occasions. She suggested the nation might be better off deporting the individual, squandering its finances, rather than the female immigrant who arrived seeking honest employment. The chamber fractured emotionally. The seating area dedicated to Omar, filled tightly with allies hailing from Cedar Riverside sporting head coverings and progressive faction pins, radiated the unique intensity of a marginalized group arriving to witness their hero battle, the figure who previously urged the nation to expel her. This section exploded vocally. The noise wasn't mere clapping, but pure validation, the audio manifestation of an audience waiting half a decade to witness those exact phrases delivered directly to that specific man. Up in the media section, a broadcasting executive silently mouthed a profane expression of shock to a coworker. On social media platforms, the video segment was already being edited even before she fully returned to her seat. Out in the corridor, her press secretary shut his eyes and breathed out heavily. Their strategy had succeeded perfectly, the verbal strike had connected, and the viral video was secured. Then, an event occurred that their strategy had completely failed to anticipate. Trump chuckled. It wasn't the typical governmental chuckle that strained, closed-mouth reaction Washington figures display when attempting to look unfazed by an attack. This was an authentic guffaw, a head-tilted, eye-squinting, shoulder-shaking burst of mirth from an individual who genuinely found the remark hilarious and lacked the ability to suppress it. The sound permeated the space exactly as his amusement always does, excessively noisy, overly drawn out, marginally improper, and entirely, organically unfeigned. The audience's response faltered immediately. The previously deafening Omar faction became hesitant, as genuine mirth directed at a verbal assault contradicts the expected behavior of a target. A targeted person is expected to recoil, shield themselves, or exhibit injury. Chuckling indicates zero injury, and zero injury signifies the offensive maneuver utterly failed. The former president shifted closer to his audio receiver, maintaining his wide smile. He noted he was honored she counted 6 insolvencies, remarking most individuals only tally 4, but declared he intended to discuss alternative figures this evening. He dismissed his corporate restructurings, claiming he transformed them into towering high-rises, and instead pivoted to her mathematics. He highlighted that the representative possessed a specific figure of her own, $250 million, which she converted not into architecture, but into absolute void. His smile remained fixed, acting as a direct armament, since an amused Trump signals a Trump holding hidden leverage. The chamber sensed this shift exactly as one perceives atmospheric pressure dropping prior to a tempest. An inevitable event was approaching. The media personnel tilted closer while the illustrators ceased their sketching. He retrieved a physical document and flourished it toward the recording devices. This motion was entirely characteristic of his dramatic, slightly ridiculous style, a figure brandishing stationery and broadcasting equipment as though the pulp itself constituted the logical proof. However, the document contained statistics, and those statistics were primed to strike Omar, much like extreme climate strikes, at terrain apathy, total coverage, and zero regard for the terrain's prior arrangements. He noted she authored the Meals Act, praising the legislation's attractive title, reasoning that opposing sustenance is impossible since no one votes against nourishing youth. Consequently, it achieved bipartisan approval, and he himself authorized it. Then he highlighted the spectacular outcome. $250 million vanished instantly. He likened it to an elite illusionist's disappearing act, noting the crucial difference that stage magicians eventually return the vanished items. The viewing area erupted in chuckles, the impartial observers, the journalists, and surprisingly, a handful of Omar's own supporters who quickly suppressed their reaction. This mirth was completely spontaneous, worsening the situation dramatically. Unplanned chuckling at an accusation of massive financial deception implies the listeners have subconsciously accepted the premise prior to consciously evaluating its validity. The former executive comprehended this dynamic perfectly, having constructed his entire professional trajectory by humorously nudging individuals toward consensus. The representative's previously clasped hands uncoupled. Her left hand drifted toward the border of her portfolio, the physical motion of someone seeking a text that could provide a counter-argument. Yet the portfolio remained shut. The movement expired mid-action, similar to how a spoken phrase perishes when the orator recognizes no conclusion will improve their predicament. He emphasized the vast sum designated for an initiative intended to nourish youth, specifically Somali youth, within her constituency. He then challenged the room to estimate the actual quantity of plates distributed, offering a clue that it was a circular digit. He employed a deliberate theatrical hesitation, the kind of silence humorists use to force listeners to privately guess the punchline. He then revealed the answer was absolute zero. For a $250 million, not a single minor obtained nutrition. He listed the fallout. 79 individuals charged, 56 admitting culpability, noting that nearly 90% of those facing justice were of Somali descent, the very demographic she constantly pledged to defend. All amusement vanished. The environment transitioned from a humorous routine into severe legal evidence, and this shift occurred so rapidly that observers retained their amused facial expressions while mentally digesting the catastrophic figures. The immense monetary loss, the total lack of nourishment provided, and the high volume of criminal charges lingered in the air like heavy furnishings dropped at an incorrect residence, excessively burdensome to shift, incapable of being overlooked, obviously meant for a specific location, yet undeniably obstructing the path. Within the representative seating block, a female wearing a blue head covering who had traveled from Cedar Riverside via a pre-dawn coach repositioned herself. She didn't flinch away from her idol, but merely adjusted her posture in the manner of someone whose physical form is reacting to data their brain is still analyzing. Trump flipped his document. His theatrical flair subsided slightly. It didn't vanish entirely, but withdrew like receding waters, exposing a much harsher, highly detailed reality beneath the surface. This transition was entirely intentional. The former leader is least predictable, not when shouting, but when reviewing text. While his shouting is easily written off as mere acting, his deliberate recitation of specific chronologies and identities from a document can only be interpreted as an individual holding concrete proof. He brought up Safari Eatery, noting the politician appeared on a Somali broadcast, speaking her native tongue rather than English, expressing gratitude to the establishment for allegedly distributing over 2,000 daily plates to minors. He claimed possession of the translated footage, reciting her exact quote, expressing deep appreciation for the establishment's role in distributing nourishment. He raised his eyes from the document. He stated the eatery was the primary hub of deception within the whole scheme, and its proprietor faced conviction. Legal authorities declared the location provided absolutely zero nourishment rather than the thousands claimed. He accused her of using ethnic media to assure her demographic in their own dialect, intentionally excluding the broader public that this business was nourishing their offspring. In reality, the establishment nourished nobody. The funds meant for thousands of daily plates were diverted into high-end vehicles, property investments, and he stressed caution here. International financial repositories actively being tracked by the Federal Finance Department. The atmospheric warmth of the chamber dropped noticeably. The specific mention of the Federal Finance Department triggered this reaction. Not the mention of legal authorities or verdicts, but the Finance Department, since that implies the national administration is hunting assets internationally. Tracking assets internationally elevates the probe beyond mere local deceit into a far more massive territory, and the observers physically sense this immense gravity descending upon them like a collapsing roof. The politician's jawline clenched. This contraction was minute, a mere flexing of the facial muscle, unnoticeable in standard environments under standard illumination. However, this was an extraordinary space equipped with 14 recording lenses, and lenses capture details organic eyes overlook. These devices documented the initial structural flaw in the asylum champion's stoicism. It wasn't a glaring break, but a microscopic fracture. This difference is crucial. A break is universally obvious, whereas a fracture requires specialized tools to detect, and 10 million broadcast monitors served as those very tools. She tilted toward her audio receiver, deploying her demographic armor, the exact defensive strategy that withstood all assaults over the past 7 years. She claimed this was a continuation of the discriminatory operations deployed in her city, which victimize Islamic neighborhoods and exploit the Somali demographic for partisan gain. Trump immediately countered, stating federal immigration enforcement was not in her city due to his actions, but rather because a massive fortune was plundered, with portions filtering back to Somalia. He insisted he didn't deploy the authorities, her specific legislation did. He then posed a question regarding who was truly harming her demographic, the individual questioning the missing funds, or the legislator who authored the loophole allowing the theft. That statement struck her seating block like a boulder thrown into a calm pond. Absolute quiet radiated outward from the rhetorical strike. This wasn't the aggressive quiet of an offended crowd, but the contemplative stillness of listeners processing crucial new information. The individuals seated there were not conservative allies. They were members of her specific ethnic background, her actual constituents. The core query he posed regarding who was truly betraying them was a dilemma several had whispered about internally for 3 years, yet they had never witnessed it broadcasted publicly by the exact figure they assumed was their adversary. In the secondary seating tier, a gentleman wearing traditional headwear detached his campaign support pin. Rather than stowing it away, he grasped it, flipping it thoughtfully, much like one handles a coin while pondering a tough choice. The former executive then altered his approach. The showman vanished, replaced entirely by the veteran property developer who dedicated half a century to scrutinizing New York fiscal documents, possessing a primal instinct for detecting when ledger digits contradicted the accompanying narrative. He announced a shift in focus to the politician's personal finances. He clarified he wasn't referring to the stolen federal funds, which he vowed to recover, but her private wealth, noting a highly suspicious activity on her wealth declaration forms. Displaying 3 sheets, he pointed out that in the previous year, her spouse's commercial holdings sat at a modest $51,000, a totally standard figure for a minor advisory agency. However, the subsequent year's identical document showed an astronomical jump to between $6 and $30 million. He marveled at the leap from $50,000 to $30 million in 12 months, noting that despite his own rapid wealth accumulation, he had never seen such speed, labeling it supernatural transmutation rather than commerce. The onlookers chuckled again, a brief, awkward sound from individuals aware that corruption isn't humorous, yet powerless to resist because the orator presented the scandal like a comedic performance. He then highlighted the climax, a recent amendment to the identical document drastically changing the massive sum back down to $95,000. She had classified the near $30 million swing as a mere bookkeeping mistake. He mocked this, noting his own clerical mistakes usually amount to $100. A discrepancy of that magnitude, he argued, constitutes a completely altered testimony to a sworn legal inquiry, not a simple typo. The representative's right hand shifted, bypassing her documents and audio equipment to firmly grip the desk's edge. It was the physical bracing of someone attempting to balance against an unstable foundation. The furniture itself remained completely static, but the surrounding environment was undeniably shifting. The chamber's allegiance was migrating rapidly from her toward the speaker holding the papers. This migration wasn't physical distance, but a massive transfer of focus, the specific atmospheric alteration that happens when rhetoric upgrades into documented federal evidence, making observers comprehend they are witnessing a sworn legal interrogation rather than a partisan argument. He pointed out her spouse's enterprise publicly boasted of overseeing $60 billion in wealth. That astronomical figure equates to a colossal financial institution, dwarfing standard investment pools, yet the firm lacks proper federal regulatory registration. Instead, it operates out of a shared hourly workspace. Managing such immense wealth from a temporary cubicle astounded him. He contrasted this by mentioning his own massive tangible real estate developments bearing his title, noting he never even boasted such extreme valuations, dryly adding that such a claim from a temporary workspace was excessively audacious even by his standards. An audible noise slipped from the viewing area. It was the distinct audio of a crowd attempting to stifle mirth, but completely failing the unique resonance of spontaneous comedy in a setting where humor is deeply unwelcome. The rear illustrator paused his work, abandoning his portrait of the Congresswoman to focus entirely on her opponent. He captured the slouched posture, the smirk, and the brandished documents. Because the narrative focus of the chamber had pivoted completely, the illustrator's duty was to document the core narrative, and the narrative had transitioned away from the politician demanding deportation, focusing instead on the figure weaponizing that demand to expose her fiscal records. The speaker finally lowered the document. For the initial moment during the session, his vocal pitch descended beneath its theatrical level. The chamber instantly registered this, just as crowds always sense a booming personality dropping their volume, signaling the entertainment has concluded and severe matters are commencing. He cited a figure of nearly $3 million, representing the total campaign funds the representative funneled to a specific advisory agency over a 2-year span. This vast sum consisted of grassroots contributions, minor $10 or $25 gifts from devoted followers, particularly struggling residents of her own district contributing funds they desperately needed, driven by ethnic solidarity. That advisory firm belonged to her now husband, whom she wed precisely at the end of that time frame. He emphasized that she transferred millions in contributor wealth to the enterprise controlled by her romantic partner, whom she subsequently married. Acknowledging his own multiple costly marriages, he stressed he personally funded his ceremonies, whereas she utilized funds from individuals like Amira. He intentionally left the name unexplained, inserting it into the atmosphere, exactly like a prosecutor introducing a victim to force the panel to recognize the human cost behind the statistics. He then painted the picture of this specific donor, a kitchen worker at a local ethnic eatery earning a meager $26,000 annually, yet faithfully contributing $50 monthly due to shared heritage. That immense proportional sacrifice from a low-wage laborer was routed directly to her partner's firm, the very individual she shared a residence with. The kitchen worker remained ignorant of this scheme then, but was fully aware now. Up in the spectator section, the previously restless female in the blue headwear ceased looking at her elected official. Instead, she stared downward at her own fingers, which were clasped together in her lap, perfectly replicating the exact hand posture the Congresswoman displayed when the session commenced. It was an identical stance of restraint, a pair of females from identical origins sharing identical body language, yet standing on completely opposite ends of a multi-million-dollar wealth transfer. The politician parted her lips to speak. The chamber, the recording devices, and the frantically writing journalists all paused. The distinct halt of typing echoed a unified realization among the press that the impending moment drastically outweighed their current transcripts. She argued that dispersing funds to campaign advisors was completely routine. Her adversary swiftly countered that routine protocol excludes wedding the advisor. He delivered this brief rebuttal, completely devoid of his signature smirk, flair, or comedic pacing. He spoke with flat, unadorned bluntness, similar to a tradesman verifying a billing charge, purely factual, stripped of embellishment, and absolutely devastating in its directness. Those few words struck the chamber and lingered, humming subtly, much like a struck metallic instrument generating a continuous, inescapable tone. The representative shut her mouth. This wasn't the exaggerated, theatrical gaping seen in typical viral political arguments, but a deeply subdued personal reaction resembling a traveler shutting an entryway upon discovering they've entered entirely the wrong structure. She shifted her gaze laterally toward her legal counsel, who was furiously scribbling on a notepad with the desperate concentration of someone desperately avoiding visual connection with their employer during a live broadcast. The counselor refused to raise his head. His writing implement continued scratching away. The silent gap separating the politician's desperate gaze and her defender's intentional evasion represented the vast divide between an individual praying for rescue and a legal professional completely aware that rescue was practically impossible. The speaker adjusted his seated posture, visibly pulling his shoulders backward and raising his jawline. It was the physical preparation of an orator readying his most critical statement of the evening, ensuring the broadcast lenses captured his expression perfectly. He stated his intention to conclude without humor, noting that all his prior points regarding the stolen millions, the fraudulent eatery, the suspicious wealth declarations, and the campaign transfers were completely accessible public knowledge that citizens could easily verify. However, he pivoted, declaring his intent to reveal confidential, currently unfolding background operations. The entire space physically ceased breathing. 200 individuals simultaneously inhaled, realizing the preceding public revelations were mere appetizers. He announced the Federal Justice Division had broadened its probe into the fraudulent nourishment initiative. This wasn't merely the initial wave of charges. This involved fresh legal demands, fresh suspects, and fresh paperwork. The authorities were now tracking the stolen assets far beyond local borders. Utilizing his executive privilege to disclose such details, he confirmed the National Finance Department was actively hunting electronic cash movements linking the fraudulent charities to foreign banking institutions. He declined to name the specific foreign nation to protect the ongoing operation, but confidently asserted the politician was fully aware of the destination, promising the public would soon share this knowledge. The representative entirely ceased all motion. She didn't merely freeze in panic, she terminated all physical movement. This medical distinction is vital. Freezing involves tense, fearful muscle contraction, whereas this total cessation occurs when the brain absorbs data so catastrophic that standard biological rhythms like regular blinking or breathing are temporarily suspended. For 4 entire seconds, she resembled a stationary portrait within an active environment. Every other attendee continued their physical micro-movements, but she remained entirely static. The media section exploded in frenetic, silent action. Journalists abandoned their narrative drafting and immediately began messaging their respective headquarters. The executive leader of the country had formally verified a massive federal escalation involving international financial tracking linked directly to an active lawmakers initiative. This transcended a simple viral video. It triggered a massive, consuming media hurricane capable of burying all competing narratives. Adding further damage, he mentioned the Federal Tax Authority was scrutinizing her spouse's firm's nonprofit classification, joking that even tax agents found a $60 billion valuation from a shared cubicle slightly suspicious. Furthermore, a capital city legal panel had unleashed document demands for all her partner's commercial entities just days prior. He cheekily admitted he likely shouldn't possess this knowledge, but as the chief executive, he accessed many restricted facts. He beamed the specific grin of an operative who had successfully triggered a massive explosive device and was gleefully evaluating the ensuing wreckage. Back in the spectator seats, the man wearing the traditional cap stopped manipulating his support pin. He placed it face up on the vacant chair next to him, deliberately leaving it unattached. The tiny item of partisan flair remained there for the duration previously displayed, now discarded, positioned for universal visibility, yet completely abandoned. The committee had inquired if the politician desired to offer a rebuttal. She did, simply because her nature dictates she must. This reaction was the ingrained survival instinct of someone who endured war zones, displacement facilities, oceanic crossings, and cultural assimilation. Such survivors never remain mute, during their own public prosecution. She rose and vocalized the exact phrases her extensive governmental tenure and primal instincts trained her to deploy. She alleged partisan persecution, attacks on her demographic, and the corrupt weaponization of federal law enforcement by the current regime. Her terminology was flawless, extracted directly from standard partisan manuals, and executed with perfectly calibrated outrage. Yet, these phrases bounced off the audience like agricultural grains scattered on cement physically there, but entirely incapable of growing. The atmosphere had permanently shifted. The enthusiastic crowd that celebrated her merely a dozen minutes prior vanished entirely. They were replaced by a collective psyche burdened with staggering statistics. Millions stolen, zero nourishment provided, wildly fluctuating wealth declarations, suspicious marital wealth transfers, and severe federal escalations involving tax and justice departments. An environment bearing that colossal factual burden simply lacked the capacity to simultaneously support her demographic victimization narrative. Forced to pick a reality, the chamber selected the raw statistics. The primary antagonist remained silent. He reclined loosely, adopting the relaxed posture of a diner awaiting his tab, not rushing to depart, but fully aware the dining experience had concluded. He deliberately avoided gazing at his opponent. Instead, he surveyed the spectators, the journalists, and the lenses, intentionally ignoring the individual who initially demanded his deportation. Directing further attention her way would seem excessively cruel, and despite his flaws, he possessed an entertainer's innate understanding of finality. The viewers required zero additional strikes. They merely needed space to process the massive blows already delivered. Out in the corridor, the politician's media manager gazed blankly at his mobile device. His previously prepared press release, boasting of his boss confronting a prejudiced executive, remained glowing on the display. It was completely obsolete. The session focused entirely on her history, not his, rendering the prepared document as useless as an admission pass to an annulled performance. He deleted the text, initiated a fresh file, keyed in a couple of words, and completely froze. He lacked any concept of how to proceed. The event generated utterly unanticipated disasters. He had anticipated rhetorical combat, but not formal declarations of massive federal investigations spanning multiple powerful agencies. These weren't partisan squabbles. This was the immense lethal apparatus of the federal authority aiming directly at his employer, declared publicly by the commander of that very apparatus. Absolutely zero public relations manuals existed that could successfully spin such severe legal threats into positive campaign momentum. He simply glared at the blinking digital cursor. Moving beyond the sanitized official narrative, reality unfolded quite differently. A pair of distinct video segments monopolized public attention, penetrating demographic sectors normally immune to legislative broadcasts. The initial segment featured the deportation remark, followed by the authentic chuckle and the devastating statistical counterattack. That specific video garnered nearly 40 million plays within 3 days. Its immense popularity stemmed entirely from the mirth. Hostile rhetoric usually triggers defensive posturing, fulfilling public expectations. When that expected shield is replaced by organic physical amusement, the variety that genuinely lights up a face and echoes heavily, viewers instantly reevaluate the situation. The offensive strike diminishes, shrinking the aggressor simultaneously. Her carefully crafted barb served as a lethal weapon for merely a minute and a half before transforming into a pathetic setup for her opponent's devastating finale. The subsequent viral segment provided zero comedic value. It documented the terrifying confirmation of massive federal mobilization. This recording showcased the executive casually deploying immense institutional power against an active legislator. Accumulating over 20 million plays, this segment bypassed standard partisan channels, infiltrating legal networks and regulatory platforms. Professional litigators recognize that an on-air executive verification of ongoing probes is a rigid factual release, not partisan rhetoric. Once broadcasted by the primary leader, such concrete disclosures become permanent historical records, immune to subsequent spin or erasure. During the initial 7 days, her team issued a defense framing the event as weaponized governance, hiding behind standard procedure. Crucially, this defense entirely ignored the missing millions, the bogus eatery, the alarming wealth shifts, the spouse's firm, and the avalanche of federal legal actions. The document solely debated the rationale behind the inquiry, intentionally dodging the actual factual revelations. In the realm of high-stakes legal warfare, attempting to justify the why while completely ignoring the what serves as a tacit admission that the facts are utterly indefensible. Her specific demographic base eventually responded, manifesting her staff's ultimate nightmare. They offered neither fury nor protection, but rather uncomfortable inquiries. An alliance of neighborhood merchants and local figureheads published a demand for complete clarity concerning the missing nutritional funds. They refrained from attacking her directly, merely pleading for her assistance in the matter. A plea for assistance from one's own voter base functions completely differently than a court order. While court orders are rigid legal tools, communal pleas carry profound ethical weight, and ethical tools inflict vastly deeper wounds in the political arena. By the second week, the Justice Department officially verified the probe's enlargement through authorized channels. They provided 0 specific names, only citing new financial tools and international movements. While this verification appeared routine, its release barely a week post-broadcast was highly deliberate. Federal authorities validate such actions due to undeniable evidence, not merely to humor executive television stunts. His declaration was dramatic, but the agency's validation was bureaucratic, symbolizing the horrific audio of governmental gears locking into place. Concurrently, the Taxation Division initiated an initial audit of her partner's enterprise. This occurred autonomously, triggered automatically by the glaring discrepancies of a firm boasting immense wealth from a temporary workspace while submitting wildly contradictory governmental forms. These red flags existed for ages without action. The gap between obvious red flags and actual audits is typically caused by governmental sluggishness. However, a nationally broadcasted exposure quickly cures such sluggishness. Entering week 3, although high-level legal panels operate covertly, their document demands are public knowledge. Her husband's legal representative admitted receiving demands regarding his various entities. This admission was a brief sentence guaranteeing full compliance with valid inquiries. The utilization of the term compliance absent the standard partisan cries of persecution or conspiracy constituted a massive verbal surrender. This specific phrasing indicates the target acknowledges the peril is authentic and has chosen survival tactics over outright defiance. The politician's war chest swelled massively, vacuuming up over $3 million rapidly. Scandal inevitably fuels financial contributions. However, the origin points shifted drastically. Local support dried up, replaced by capital from distant coastal states. When political funding originates primarily from outsiders, it indicates the local constituents are pondering troubling questions that distant observers remain completely blind to. Back in her home district, the local kitchen worker reviewed the viral footage on her mobile device while resting. She viewed it multiple times, freezing the frame exactly when the executive uttered her identity. They were strangers, yet he broadcasted her existence globally, linking her meager income and devoted monthly gifts to the concept of community loyalty. Her private existence was suddenly intertwined with a colossal scandal viewed by an ocean of citizens. Lowering the screen, she resumed her labor. She refrained from terminating her recurrent contribution for that specific cycle. However, for the initial occasion, in over half a decade, she actually paused to evaluate it. For an individual who contributed blindly for years, The mere act of pausing to evaluate served as a profound resolution in itself. The representative began the evening demanding the nation expel the individual squandering its wealth. By the session's conclusion, her opponent had expelled something entirely different, a devastating invoice. He presented the $250 million, the millions in campaign transfers, the wild wealth discrepancies, and the absurd corporate valuation. Every single digit was authenticated, extracted directly from governmental documents, and currently being scrutinized by an empowered Justice Division, a tracking finance department, an auditing tax agency, and an active legal panel. She had demanded he deport her,